On that topic, I'm going to move into our next talk, which I'm giving, which looks at a number of different soil health components and specific relationships to yield decline, and then maybe some potential cultural management options. We started this project a couple years ago with funding from the Red Raspberry Commission, and it's entering into second year of data, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to split this talk with Eric Grabant from British Columbia, and so we'll split about halfway through, probably mostly Eric. But I first want to point. Sorry about that. I first want to point to a workshop that's coming up in February in Mount Vernon, just south of here. It's coordinated slightly by the Soil Quality Network, and it's going to be covering cropping systems that are very wide, but it will potentially be applicable to small fruit growers in this region. And the website's up above, and I don't think we have our handouts anymore at our booth, right? No. Okay. What's that? I doubt it, but I don't think so. So last year we surveyed a number of different raspberry growers, and this is not a new issue, the decline issue, but I wanted to just sort of share some of this information. And with respondents of about 27, as far as seeing a recent decline in raspberry productivity, about 70% said yes. Now, depicting what that means in terms of length, about 60% said that their fields last about less than 7 years. And of those 60%, or 59% in this case, the majority of them, a little bit over 50%, said that those same plantings lasted closer to 13 years a decade ago. So within, relatively short single rotation, that lifespan has halved essentially. So, and of course, Inga has hit on a lot of those issues, but. Part of what this project is looking at is taking a wider scope of the overall soil health, and I just want to sort of throw out a definition: the capacity of soil to function, to sustain productivity, and eventually to promote plant and animal health. And that's sort of the holistic perspective that through the various sampling that we're utilizing in this project and have been utilizing. And that's looking at a number of different factors, but most notably utilizing what Cornell has developed as a soil health test, looking at three major categories: the physical, pardon, this is hard to read, the biological, and then of course the chemical. And they've boiled this down, this 200 and some odd metric, down into a subset of a very important, and that's largely what we're looking at here. And we've utilized this infrastructure and this structure to design the sampling procedures that we've undergone over the past couple of years. And the physical, some of these are points in time you don't necessarily have to do repeatedly over time. Things like soil texture change over very long time periods. Aggregate stability, depending on where you're sampling within a small fruit system, really will not vary highly. Water capacity, soil strength, and then we get into the biologicals. That's organic matter content and the active carbon content, and then we get down into, probably most importantly, is the plant pathogen component. And we've targeted and narrowed this down based on previous work that has been mentioned to a subset of microorganisms. And then of course we've included the chemical component, which is almost most importantly in Western Washington, the pH, but a number of different macro and micronutrients. So a little bit on the trial details, and I talked about this last year, so I'm not going to really hammer this home, but for those of you that weren't here or have probably forgotten, I'm just going to remind you. But these are occurring in two commercial fields, They're a little over acre and a half about an acre and a half in size, and we're looking at both the plant and the soil component. And the most important aspect of this is the changes that occur over time. Now, the objectives are to evaluate these changes, and we're again utilizing that CADRE suite of soil health indicators, but also to potentially look at some cultural management options. As Inga alluded to, there's very few during production cycle management options for a lot of the soil-borne health organisms. So how do we, over time, buy ourselves some benefits? And I think, fortunately or unfortunately, as Inga mentioned, the fumigation process itself is kind of a reset. And so it'll be interesting to see how the changes that we may or may not instigate through the course of time in this trial may be reset by that process. So again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time getting into treatments. This is, I can't underscore the complexity that's involved in everything that we're doing, but I'll go through it slightly to kind of give you guys an idea. So again, the treatments that we've overlaid are designed to be compatible with currently bearing raspberries. Our main plot is looking at two different types of irrigation systems. And this is largely modeled after the trial that was initiated just north of here in the border by Tom Forge et al. And included a lot of those components, but included a couple others that we'll get into here in a minute. So the first is utilizing a tensiometer driven irrigation line versus just sort of a standard grower, turn it on for X number of hours and then rotate on to the next system. And that tensiometer driven line prematurely shuts when we reach a certain soil moisture level. So it's in effect utilizing less water to hopefully derive the same amount of plant and and the importance of that is of course, is maintaining adequate soil moisture. As Inga alluded to, in some cases there can be over-irrigation that can be occurring because people are busy. Those that are managing are just kind of simply rotating the irrigation plots or fields through the irrigation schedules. The second, and this is some of the questions that came up before, looking at how can we feed into the soil, how can we feed the soil through a variety of or different organic matter inputs, most notably utilizing a variety of different ground covers. That includes two different timings, ones that are simply planted in the fall and those that are planted in the fall and the spring combined. We have a perennial ground cover that's occurring at only one farm, and then sort of a traditional bare ground till. And last is looking at some different nutrient management options, and this is largely going on at one farm, but we're hoping to initiate these in 2014 at the second site. Utilizing a spring soil-driven nutrient application rate as opposed to sort of a more traditional method, which may or may not rely on that. But in 2013, we also included tissue sampling into that. Again, also beginning in this year, we included the addition of compost because Tom Forge did see some benefits brought about by that. And those are largely composted dairy solids. Something we have a lot of around here. So one of the things that actually Inga brought up that's really quite, and you'll see a little bit this here in a bit, is starting to build those relationships, particularly in space, but over time. And we can do that because of the design of this project. It's sort of hyper sampling in a very small area, and then we can start to build based on the changes at any one given point in the relationship that it has with those points around it, whether it be a pathogen population or a nutrient level, okay? And we won't largely get into this today because of the purposes of time, but it allows us from a scientific perspective really large statistical power and the ability to really dig deep into some of the trends that may or may not going on. As you can see an example, and these are actually the various components in one of the fields at a given time period. So I'm only going to talk about, because again, a course of time, two major physical components, and then I'm going to, I'll talk about, briefly introduce the biological component, and then I'll turn it over to Eric to talk a little bit about the yield. But one of the big things that is a constant ongoing issue particularly in raspberry production is this sort of annual cycle of compaction that results namely from the number of passes that go on within a course of a time, but particularly post-harvest, with the harvesters continually cycling over and over in that very narrow band of soil. And we're talking at this point, between row. But basically what's happening here is all the air is being removed from within that soil structure. And what results is this vastly reduces water infiltration rate. And as you can imagine, and as many of you have seen, in the course of time at this time period, or in the middle of winter, standing water in fields, for those that either haven't deep ripped or haven't performed some sort of tillage activity to try to alleviate that, what ends up happening is with compaction, or this annual cycle, is the continual need for tillage. And what that does is that slowly depletes the soil of organic matter, and potentially, which can bring about a number of different detrimental effects. The second piece second physical component I want to talk about is infiltration, and this is usually directly related to compaction, though as we'll see here in a minute, I think there's some, not necessarily directly correlated, but this really, to go out and measure this in the field, gives you a sense of, okay, how are we leading to standing water in field, which could theoretically directly link to soil pathogen presence, as Inga did allude to. Okay, so this is what we're looking at here is I've just, for purposes of discussion and demonstration, pulled together a set of data. We're looking at compaction at one farm, and I just simply pulled out a set of treatments. We're looking at the 4 different tillage regimes. Again, a fall cover crop, outlined in blue, our no tillage, no cover crop, or just simple standard continual till throughout the course of the year. Our spring planted only, and then that's followed by a fall. So that has the highest amount of cover crop input over the course of a year, and then a perennial ground cover. And what we're looking at is the pressure needed to exert to get a probe into the ground over the course of depth. So as we move from left to right, we're going from about 0 to about 10 inches in depth, okay? And as you can see, generally across the course, we're seeing a general decline down to 10 inches in the compaction. Where we get down below 500 psi, that's fairly low levels of compaction. And I should mention, this is in early August, right after the end of harvest so this is about the worst compacted time of the year that we can evaluate this, and we did this on purpose, of course. Now, one thing that I want to note is that if we look at the data, and I'm just going to pull this out first, we can see that at about 2 inches to about 5.5 inches, we start to see some significant differences in the different tillage regimes in terms of their ability to prevent compaction. Generally, what we see is a separation between the fall planted cover crop as being significantly lower than the spring or the full till. And what's going on there is that largely, at least in my eyes, is that cover crop has been incorporated and is now acting sort of like a sponge to all the compaction. There's all that carbonaceous material that's within the soil matrix, and is preventing that at a fairly shallow depth, again down to about 5.5 inches. Now, interestingly enough, we saw an increase in the perennial ground cover at that same depth. Now, this is actually expected at the age, I should have mentioned the age of these plantings. They're going into their 3rd year. In reduced tillage systems, it takes a course of time to alleviate that compaction, particularly, and that's what this is a reduced till, a no-till system, essentially. Within this soil profile, I will suspect that over the course of the next couple of years, that significant difference will become essentially removed. And interestingly enough, when we start to look at, so this is sort of, I want to come back to that point here in a minute, but this is sort of the traditional post-harvest practice, is to go in and deep rip that compacted layer. And what we've largely found is that potentially, and of course this is 1 year of data, that maybe we can alleviate at least one of these passes, by utilizing, spring or fall plant, a fall planted cover crop. Now, what this means in practicality is we went out and measured infiltration. So this is kind of a silly activity to do, but you place a ring and you pour water into it and you time the amount of time that the water takes to infiltrate in that water. Now this was done at the same time of year. We did do this repeatedly over the course of this season, but I thought this was the most interesting data. What we saw, again, the compaction levels were significantly higher in the perennial ground cover and significantly lower in the fall ground cover, okay? And there was no difference between the full till and the spring planting. And what we see is a little bit of a different story when we talk about infiltration. So this is kind of the resulting effect, or what is expected, the resulting effect of compaction in the ability of the soil to drain out that water, which we want it to do, because if we have standing water, the likelihood of disease incidence is potentially increased. And what we're seeing here is that the spring is significant. In this case, the higher the number, the faster the drainage. And what we see is there's no significant difference when we talk about the fall versus our perennial ground cover. So they are synonymous in their ability to drain out water. So that's different, even though they were different in terms of their compacted ability. And what I think is happening here is the perennial ground cover is maturing, and the root system is allowing and creating macropores within that system to allow it to drain and preferentially flow through along those root lines. And I think that is a really big advantage. And I suspect that we'll only see this increase or become more synonymous like some of the other cover crop systems. So switching gears, looking at the biological component, I'm just going to quickly introduce this, and then I'm going to hand it over to Eric. What Inga spent a good bit of time talking about pea penetration, so I won't do that. But what I do want to note is up here in our upper left-hand corner, this is going into our third year of these plantings, and as you alluded to, particularly at one farm, the levels are getting significantly high, as I think you had suggested. And what we're looking at is but there is a significant difference in the populations, whether it's if we're looking at the actual within the root system or the soil itself, between the two sites, where we're seeing, in some cases, hundreds and, several hundred-fold increase between those two. But the alarming thing is one is the fact that the levels are so high at this point in time, but I think based on what Inga said, that's expected and pattern-wise. But also the rate of increase over the course of a year is fairly significant, whereas in the case of the higher levels, where in 2012 we're looking at a little over 1,700 in grams per root, and now we're looking at close to over 4,000. So significant increase in that time period. So two things to note on this is the differences in populations between farms, but also the rate at which they've changed over time. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Eric. Yeah. I'm not sure I do this, but laser forward.
So I'm very thankful for having had the opportunity to come down here during the season, get out of Canada for a few days to do some sampling in the U.S. I came down to the plots that Chris and the American team, shall we call them, have established down here. And I just went to each of the plots that are in each of the two fields that we're working in, and I sampled the early, mid-season, and late-season fruit weight, and then I used a technique called yield component analysis to estimate the yield in each one of these plots, to give us an estimate of how the plants are reacting to all the things that are being measured by the team down here. So I calculated an average fruit weight, but then I also used a weighting factor where I counted the mid-season fruit weight as twice as important as either of the early and late fruit weights. And then I used both the average and the weighted average to calculate the yield estimate, which is based on counts of number of canes per plant, number of laterals per cane, and number of fruit per lateral. And then based on the three major factors that are being manipulated in the field, I just ran some statistics, which is the fun part of this trial, I believe, because there's just so much data to work with. And the first thing I found was that there is no significant effect of the irrigation treatments on the fruit weight or the yield of those plots. And that's actually an interesting and good result so far. It means that you can reduce the amount of water that's being applied using a tensiometer-driven irrigation regime and not have a significant negative effect on the plant. Also, the two different fertility regimes, one being a standard fertilizer regime and the other one being driven by soil analyses in the spring. Neither of those had a negative, or sorry, the alternate fertility treatment did not have any negative effects on any of the variables that I measured. But then when we got to ground cover, we saw some really interesting results where they had a significant effect on all the variables that were measured in terms of plant response. And in general, that response was to have the no cover crop or the tillage system having a greater yield and fruit size than the fall and spring treatments, and that being greater than the perennial turf treatment at this time. So I just throw up a few graphs here to show the 4 different treatments. And so we're comparing plots that have fall planted cover crop, no cover crop, and the spring and fall versus the perennial turf. And this is the early fruit weight. We can see that there's a significantly higher fruit weight for the tilled treatment, and then the fall and spring being somewhere intermediate between that and the perennial. Mid-season, we're seeing the same effect for mid-season fruit weight. Same thing again for late-season fruit weight, and again for the average. This is taking all 3 of those numbers and averaging them, where the no cover treatment has got a higher fruit weight than the fall and the spring, and the perennial turf being significantly lower than both of those. When it comes to the yield estimate, which is what everybody's interested in, is this going to affect how much fruit you take out of the field? We see the exact same response. But statistically speaking, this is much lower because it was only on one farm, and that one farm had a lower yield in general. So actually, when we split up the 2 farms, we're not going to see such a drastic effect here. This is just did some initial analysis so that you'd be able to see it for now. And Chris and his team had also come in and measured the diameter of the primocanes. You measured them in millimeters, right? Okay, well, it seems the metric system is making it around the world here. And we saw a significant difference in the primocane diameter, though at this stage, who really cares how big your primocanes are when really this is what's important. But in the years to come, this is going to be important because this is going to relate to the vigor of the plant, and down the road, that may have an impact on how quickly it declines, depending on how vigorous the vegetative side of the plant is. And so I'm not that good of an artist or conceptual person, but I tried to make a little flow chart so we can think about this conceptually. There's the things that we can do something about, which are those field management practices, irrigation, fertility, and ground cover. There's the soil nutrient, disease, pressure, and health factors, the core set that Chris and his team is going to continue to measure over time. Those are the underlying connections to what we actually want to improve, which is the yield and the vigor. So in this first year, we've got a lot of data, and more is coming in by the day on the underlying factors, all the soil nutrient and health and biological, chemical, and physical factors. We're going to be able to make associations between what we can do about the planting to what we want to improve. And so as an initial analysis of that in this first year, before we get into multi-year data in the future, I took some box plots, and I know we don't like looking at box plots, but look at that little black line there. Up in this top corner, I've got the plant response that we actually care about, so it's the mid-season fruit weight, and this is significantly associated with the 4 treatments in the bottom. And then those same 4 treatments are significantly associated with an aspect of soil nutrient or health. So over here we got soil magnesium percent base saturation, soil pH, soil potassium, various responses here Same graph, this is the fruit weight up here. And then there was, I guess I could look at my sheet here, nitrate, phosphorus, boron, and then P penetrans numbers, the root lesion nematode. So we're not going to try and interpret this at this stage, because what we need to do is start to see this over time. So we'll see over time how the management practices are going to change the plant responses that we're concerned with. And then by looking at the variables that are underlying it, we'll see what's actually changing. And therefore, we can say, all right, this one treatment that's being applied is affecting the plant in a good way. And this is underlying it, what's going on. So let's figure out a new solution that's going to affect the soil or the biological factors in the soil in the same way, so that we can continue to improve yields or slow decline. And I don't think it's worthwhile spending any more time looking at any more of those graphs, and I'm sure I'm nearing the end of my available time. So let's get to the outcomes and the prospects. Something that Chris mentioned is that this is really about what happens over time. He saw that 7-year window of a planting for 60% of people's fields. If we can look at the planting over the course of the 3rd year all the way, or started in the 2nd year all the way to the 7th year, or if the plantings stay in longer, we're going to be able to see if the infiltration factor or the penetration, the compaction of the soil has an early negative effect as a result of the ground cover treatments, but then later on down the road, whether it flips around and has a positive effect. And we'll be able to track that by looking at all the soil nutrient, chemical, and biological factors. And so the intention is to take these same trial plots and start adapting the management protocols. So bringing in new treatments, using compost in the following year, and seed meal, I think, are in the works. I'm not involved in that really, so I don't know much more about it than you do and what Chris has described to me. But he's got plans to take our results and continue to adapt new management practices, and in order to direct future management in raspberry fields. That's all I had to say. Is there anything else you would like to say at the end? Okay, then I'll give some acknowledgement to the CSANR, the Washington Red Raspberry Council, and the RADC for supporting this work. And we'll open the floor to some questions.
I think we're out of time for questions.
Okay.
You got a quick question, Mark? Or we're just changing slides? You have to yell.
Test.
All your cover crop treatments.
I think why do we have yield suppression in result of the cover crop treatments? And actually, the first time I ever met you, I asked you that very same question. And you said that that's just what people have seen. Does that answer your question? And ask it right back to you?
True academic, turning it back on the person asking the question. You have an answer for it, Mark? No?
I might be making it up then.
Okay.